without further ado, the first talk on our agenda today is talk by Dr. Haydn Washington from the University of New South Wales. His talk is titled Transformative Pathways, Rediscovering Wonder, Applying Eco-Reciprocity and Overcoming Denial. So I'm just going to try to share my screen and play his recording. There we go. Is this visible to everybody? All right.
Hello, my name is Haydn Washington. I'm an environmental scientist from the University of New South Wales in Australia.
Heather, we can't hear anything.
All right. That's a bit odd. Let me try that.
Sometimes when you share the screen, you have to tick the little box saying share the sound, but I don't know.
Oh. Oh, ah. Oh.
Well, looking beyond the usual suspects for key aspects of the problem and the solutions. So I'm looking at three important factors and solutions that are often not discussed in academia or society. The need to rediscover wonder, a sense of wonder towards nature, the need to adopt eco-reciprocity, and overcoming denial. Now, I don't believe we can transform society without adopting these.
Oh dear. Okay, I think what I'll do is we'll kind of switch around the order while I figure this out. And if I can't, I mean, it's a recording, so we will be posting it on our website anyway, and we can share it with you guys. And you've got, again, in the chat earlier that I've posted Haydn's email for any questions based on that. So I will try to sort it, and if I can't, I will just share the recording with you guys. So do apologize for this technical issue here. So yes, so then let's there we go. Okay, so let's move on then to our second speaker. So if she's ready. So this is a talk, well, joint talk by Professor Rosaleen Duffy and Professor Dan Brockington from the University of Sheffield, giving a talk entitled Political Ecologies of 30 by 30. Over to you, Rosaleen.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thanks for convening the panel as well. It's to be really exciting, I think. So I'm going to try and share my screen. If it doesn't work, then it's fine, because I can just, oh, it says host disabled participant screen share.
Right, on it.
Technology, don't you just love it? I think this is going to be the back of the pandemic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But while we're trying to sort that out, I'll just give you a little bit of background to the paper, which is that this is something that Dan Brockington and I are kind of working on currently, and we're working through some ideas. So feedback and comments are really welcome. And what it was generated from was these kinds of, the ways that these concerns about biodiversity loss have led to ambitious, even, sometimes called radical global targets to prevent or reverse declines in species, such as protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. That's the 30 by 30 initiative, and to eventually half Earth, which is 50% by 2050. So I'm going to try and share the screen now.
Yes, you should be good to go now, Rosaleen.
Good, thank you. So can you see that? Yeah, brilliant. I think something's going well anyway. So I'll just skip across these. So basically, the sort of the 30 by 30 initiative is what we want to do is take a political ecology approach to understanding the growth of these kind of planetary scale schemes and the powerful, and kind of develop an understanding of the powerful global networks that support them and their potential impact on the ground. So 30 by 30 is advocated by these powerful global networks, and that's most likely to be endorsed at the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity now in 2022. So what is 30 by 30? And it refers to this campaign to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, and then half Earth 50% by 2050. And this will be done through the expansion of protected areas, and also through something called other effective conservation measures, or OECMs. And at the moment, that's very underspecified as what will constitute OECMs and who'll define them. And this is now, we've just had the IUCN Congress this week. It's ongoing at the moment. And it's been accompanied by approaches and slogans, and now hashtags of nature-based solutions, nature positive, and no net loss. It's financially supported by the WIS Foundation, and in 2018, there was a $1 billion donation to get the campaign for nature up and running to promote 30 by 30 at international fora. So the idea is both powerful and simple. It sounds great. Protect 30% of the planet, and that will save the entire planet, all of humanity, all of biodiversity. This attracts media, social media, philanthropists, donors, governments, and the private sector. It's an easy banner headline that everyone can sign up to. And the new hashtag is Love 30 by 30. It's also powerfully advocated by a global network of scientists, and it's been written into the draft text for the COP15. So it will shape conservation policy worldwide over the next decade. And so many different kinds of interest groups have come behind it that the momentum for this campaign is really remarkable. So taking a kind of political ecology approach to understanding this, a political ecology lens allows us to raise these kinds of really serious concerns about how these ambitious targets will play out on the ground. So political ecology has already produced this really substantial body of literature critiquing mainstream conservation, big conservation NGOs, as continuing to push forward capitalist and colonial approaches to biodiversity conservation. And central to this body of work is research that highlights the ways that conservation has a really long history of marginalising, displacing and impoverishing minorities in rural areas. And they live particularly in the areas that conservationists want to protect. So there's this clear risk that ambitious new conservation priorities will extend this marginalisation and loss. And so proponents of the initiatives, they do argue that human interests are central, and that they'll work with local communities and Indigenous peoples. This is part of some of the sort of key scientific literature that underpins 30 by 30 by people like Dinnerstein, And there's a flourishing of publications in prestigious journals like Science and Nature. But one of the very clear things about these high-profile publications is they neglect to count people where they live. And this is really problematic because these proposals are likely to involve changes to land use, livelihoods, and the lifeways of rural people. So it seems to exemplify the complaint made by Tauli Corpus that the importance of rural peoples for conservation is yet to be acknowledged by the broader conservation community. So there's growing criticism of the science. So this refrain of follow the science, we need to really critique what does that science mean and the assumptions and principles of conservation prioritization. So how do we define which areas to prioritize, which areas to declare new protected areas, which areas to enforce those protected areas? And some civil society organisations have been really actively campaigning against this new 30% target, including Survival International, who called it the biggest land grab in history. And 49 foundations signed a letter in the last couple of weeks in protest at the plans because of the violent legacies of which they could extend. So I think it's worth talking about what those violent legacies are. So under the leadership of international conservation NGOs like WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, working in concert with national governmental institutions, protected areas have become heavily militarised zones in some places, and they're increasingly patrolled by armed eco-guards committing extensive atrocities. So human rights violations, including the wholesale involuntary removal of entire communities. And these have been abundantly documented for decades by journalists, civil society organisations, and by academics as well. So eco-guards supported by WWF, for example, in Cameroon, DRC, Congo and Central African Republic, Nepal and India have bound to be repeatedly engaged in torture, beatings, rape and extrajudicial killings as part of their conservation implementation. And these abuses have been confirmed by multiple investigations, including a report by an independent panel of experts commissioned by WWF itself after pressure. I'll illustrate some of these issues more clearly by just talking briefly about militarisation of conservation, which again is a really key theme in the sort of political ecology field. So the implementation of 30 by 30, the key critical issue is that it will be left to national governments to determine where those areas will be and how they're enforced. Political ecologists have consistently highlighted this history of and recent expansion of the use of more forceful and violent methods in conservation. And this is most obvious in strategies to tackle poaching and the illegal wildlife trade, especially in areas that contain large, charismatic and economically valuable wildlife. So while militarisation is focused around protected areas in the global south, especially Africa, South Asia and South America, there are well-documented examples of how its negative impacts play out on the ground. So political ecologists have led these debates on green militarisation. I've stuck some key references there in the slide if any of you want to follow them up. So these more militarised responses have also tended to be justified by this appeal to the urgent need to prevent the loss of these really important species that are so globally loved as well. And the articulation of conservation and illegal wildlife trade as an issue of security and of crime has translated into a policy that increasingly promotes and privileges responses around legal and juridical reform, criminal investigations, intelligence gathering, law enforcement technologies, informant networks, and of course the use of deadly force. So where does the support for this come from? So if we look at international funding for these strategies, the redefinition of illegal wildlife trade and conservation as a security threat produced shifts in the types and levels of funding that were available for tackling it. And these trends are mirrored by other funders like Global Environmental Facility, USAID and World Bank and the European Commission as well. So if we look at the UK DEFRA figures, you can see that by 2019, the UK government had allocated 23 million, which had been spent on 75 projects. And large chunks of that money had gone to specific organisations like Wildlife Conservation Society and Zoological Society of London. And the relative balance of projects across 3 themes of sustainable livelihoods, strengthening law enforcement and demand reduction showed that there were 62 funded projects for law enforcement and criminal justice, but only 6 for livelihoods and 7 for demand reduction. So, so what we can see then as well is that in terms of geographical breakdown, there were much more funding for projects in Africa and Asia than in other areas of the world. And I think this shift in funding equals material support for the extension of much more forceful forms of implementation of conservation policy on the ground. And using the political ecology lens allows an examination of these sort of asymmetric power dynamics between global elites and often very marginalised communities that experience the uneven effects of these policy shifts at the international level. So if I look at as well at the sort of the rationale behind this is that the articulation of illegal wildlife trade and dealing with poaching and securing conservation as a security threat is an important part of allocating additional funding for security-oriented approaches in conservation. And this framing has been central to several big conservation NGO campaigns like WWF International, Wildlife Conservation Society, and International Fund for Animal Welfare, amongst many others. And political ecologists have pointed out that this characterisation of local communities often as poachers or as a threat is used to justify much more interventionist and security-oriented responses to save wildlife. And NGOs make these links to draw attention to the threats to wildlife and to drive fundraising efforts. So conservation NGOs have been at the forefront of arguing that doing what's good for conservation will also tackle the financing of armed groups. And this rationale has been rendered even more powerful because it's been taken up by states and donors. But the difficulty is, of course, is that these approaches do very little to address the structural conditions that draw people into the poaching economy in the first place. So arguments about terrorism and about illegal wildlife trade tap into a pre-existing and deep-seated global fear about terrorism post 9/11. So the first US president to, sort of really raise the profile of illegal wildlife trade as a security threat was Barack Obama in 2013, and it's remained very central to US government policy making for successive administrations since. And also for NGOs, since they need to compete for funds, it makes financial sense to link conservation and security together. And the consequences of this on the ground are heavier levels of enforcement, militarisation and violence at the hands of conservation authorities, coupled with the very uneven effects of the extension of trafficking networks and poaching activities in exactly the same spaces. So one other theme that we wanted to bring to the fore around these discussions of 30 by 30 is that of data justice. So we have to attend not just to the sort of violent forms of implementing conservation, but also address the much more subtle, more insidious forms of exclusion and omission that can just creep into conservation planning work and then therefore into implementation. And these derive from the sorts of data that are used and the way that these data are processed. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of set of arguments that Robert Watson put forward this morning about following the science, because planetary scale prioritisation for conservation is driven by large data sets, often based on remote sensing or global models of land use, food production, biodiversity and human population distributions. And their assumptions mean that there's kind of an input of data, and the spatial temporal resolution can obscure certain types of people's presence and their activity and introduce new forms of bias and misrecognition. So, for example, maps of human activity that use electric light don't capture off-grid mobile populations or informal activity and settlements. They're only poorly captured in some resolutions. And this invisibilizes those communities, and it makes it look like those are empty lands that can be turned into these new protected areas. At larger scales, the economic valuations of rural livelihoods tend to attribute much higher values to urbanites in the global north and devalue rural communities in the global south. So data sets that are based on human capital and on the statistical value of life will be based on projected salary earnings, which will of course privilege the global north and discriminate against lifeways of the south. So the data used in conservation prioritisation could easily deepen exclusion, marginalisation and injustice. And Dan Brockington, who I'm working with on this, he got together a group of us probably around about a year ago to write a response in an open letter to a policy document that did exactly this. It identified areas for prioritisation, but none of the authors were from the global south. The information, the research that was to underpin 30 by 30 was primarily being produced in a very small number of institutions in the global north. So all of this kind of exclusion becomes much more likely as conservation data are using more social media data, remote sensing, and so on, all these kinds of sort of remote modelling. And in this respect, political ecologists working on 30 by 30 could learn a lot from the data justice community, because its work is driven by the need to see how injustice itself is built in to the construction and analysis of these very large scale data sets. So data justice research is essential to understanding the inequalities and the risks inherent in these kinds of practices. So I'll finish up now, so I'm sure I'm probably nearly out of time. So to sort of conclude, 30 by 30 sounds really good, but we really need to examine who's pushing it and who's pushing back and be aware of these power asymmetries. There are real concerns about lip service being paid to Indigenous rights and sort of engagement with or working with Indigenous communities rather than thinking about how Indigenous communities might lead and define conservation. So the language of partnership and engagement is used instead of centering Indigenous-led conservation. And concerns about the science underpinning 30 by 30, this sort of common refrain of follow the science, as if it's some kind of apolitical and neutral black box. So we need to look at these underpinning knowledges, who's producing them, where they're produced and where they're circulated. But thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rosaleen, for that excellent paper, providing us with a lot of food for thought and echoing some of the themes that we've already come across, namely around the role of power in global environmental politics and in issues around biodiversity conservation. So I've tried to fiddle around with the video and I still can't figure it out. So what I do is I will post Haydn's talk on our website, and I will be sending out a tweet later on this afternoon after the day's proceedings, just letting everybody know that it's up and have with the link for you guys to follow to view it. So we'll be proceeding now with our next speaker. Very pleased to introduce Joshua Barritt from the University of Manchester. Josh will be presenting a paper entitled "The Post-Wild: Adaptation, Restoration and Transformative Change in Biodiversity Conservation." Over to you, Josh.
Okay, thanks Heather for having me. Let me just, sorry Heather, it says host disabled participation screen sharing.
Oh yes, sorry, let me make you a co-host so that can be sorted. All right, good, okay, you're good to go.
Great, thanks. Okay, so in 2019, the IPS Global Assessment highlighted that current approaches to biodiversity conservation aren't sufficient to stem the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, and thus called for transformative change in biodiversity governance. But there are questions remaining as to what constitutes transformation and how it's implemented. So in a review published earlier this year, Massarella et al. Identified 3 overarching paradigms of transformative change in the biodiversity conservation literature: naturalism, the post-wild, and justice. I'm going to focus on talking about the post-wild strand today in relation to adaptation and restoration, in part because of its growing prominence in international policy circles, and also because of my own research on coral restoration. So there are two broad arguments that I want to make. The first being that the post-world has the potential to be transformative in terms of both how and why conservation is undertaken, and doing this by drawing on Blythe-Tell's definition of what transformation is. So that being profound changes in the structures, processes, rules and norms that produce radical reconfigurations in social, political, economic and or ecological aspects of governance. But I also want to argue that post-world interventions should only act as secondary and complementary strategies to interventions that tackle the primary causes of biodiversity loss. So the failure to stem biodiversity loss has inspired the rise of new proposals for conservation that have the potential to spark both changes in biodiversity conservation and practice, with Emma Maris's Rambunctious Garden being one of the most prominent of these proposals. And I think something it does, which is quite important, is that it challenges pristineness as the core value of biodiversity conservation, and sees pristineness as both unachievable and also undesirable. New conservation or the Rambunctious Garden metaphor also broadens the goals of biodiversity conservation beyond solely mitigating environmental change, and where appropriate, it also adopts adaptation and restoration as valid conservation policies and practices. So the post-wild, including adaptation and restoration, is important because it's increasingly being mainstreamed into international policy circles, which are seemingly legitimizing it, these adaptation and restoration approaches. In 2019, the UN adopted 2021 to 2030 as the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and the 2021 first detailed draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework includes a target to ensure at least 20% of ecosystems are under restoration. And restoration is also seen as integral for achieving this, quote, net improvements, end quote, for the Convention of Biological Diversity's 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. So I don't agree with the targets, but I think they're important just in the context, especially in relation to 30 by 30. So I do want to acknowledge, these very serious and very valid critiques of restoration. As I've mentioned, restoration does not tackle the root drivers of environmental change. It potentially promotes biodiversity offsetting. It's expensive, experimental. It's been called a techno fix. Usually it operates at a very small scale, and it also maintains the status quo in terms of neoliberalization of conservation. And these percentage-based targets, which we've had since 1992, have not been effective. So I don't think it makes sense to have a 20% target. But, oh, sorry, no, there's one other thing. Ecosystem restoration and prioritization maps are also disproportionately place this burden on Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So as we've seen with 30 by 30, there's this very real danger of restoration interventions falling into the trap of fortress conservation models and dispossessing local peoples and indigenous communities. So I want to move on to talk a bit now more specifically about coral adaptation and restoration. So an increase of 2 degrees of warming is estimated to result in a loss of more than 99% of coral reefs globally. And this is really significant because coral reefs support 25% of marine biodiversity, and over 500 million people depend on coral reefs for their food security and livelihoods. And what we're seeing now is a shift in approach to coral reef conservation, with 88% of country members of the International Coral Reef Initiative now being interested in adopting coral restoration as a conservation measure. So I think the support amongst ICRI countries comes out of a growing consensus that established interventions are now insufficient on their own for corals to survive in a changing climate. And instead, what we're seeing is this new paradigm of reef management emerging, in which there are calls for greenhouse gas emissions to be mitigated at a global scale, local management of coral reefs to be improved. So that's kind of mitigation of things like marine pollution and land-based pollution, but also investments in coral reef adaptation and restoration. So in this sense, coral reef adaptation and restoration do not tackle the root causes of degradation, but I think they should be seen as potentially valuable tools within a wider conservation toolkit that can support coral reefs as secondary and complementary approaches in addition to mitigation interventions. So I also think that coral reef adaptation restoration interventions are potentially transformative by producing radical reconfigurations in what coral ecologies are able to survive projected climatic conditions. Australia's Reef Restoration Adaptation Programme is currently the world's largest and most ambitious initiative of this type. And among a broad range of interventions, this programme is attempting to develop interventions that simultaneously increase coral thermal tolerance, mass-produce corals through coral aquaculture, and also develop methods to actually restore these aquaculture corals back onto coral reefs. So not only is it attempting to produce radical reconfigurations of marine ecologies in a changing climate as part of an ecological transformation, but these initiatives are also attempting to remove barriers to implementation that restoration has been critiqued for, namely by intervening at scale and also actually reducing the cost of intervention. And there are also plans to transfer these technologies and implement them in other coral-bearing states. Now, of course, there are a myriad of, I think, ethical implications, which maybe we can discuss in the Q&A. But I think it's just interesting that this is a set of programs or initiatives which are now becoming reality. So I think as well, there's also evidence of profound changes in the structures, rules, and norms of conservation decision-making and implementation processes in coral reef restoration, which would qualify under Blythe-Patel's social and political transformations definitions. And this is because coral reef restoration has been largely experimental and been undertaken by a range of non-state actors at a local level. These initiatives have often centered on local values, knowledges, and goals, which have resulted in governance structures which are appropriate to the local context. Moreover, coral restoration initiatives that more actively involve Indigenous peoples and local communities in these processes do tend to be more effective. And as such, for the post-wild or restoration to constitute transformative change, they must be tied to human rights and justice-based approaches to conservation. Additionally, many locally led coral restoration interventions have taken place outside protected areas. And I think this is significant and could be also potentially transformative in terms of not only who makes decisions and implements conservation activities, but also where we're seeing conservation take place. So refusing an expansion of protected areas. Moreover, I think locally led interventions outside protected areas could be an important part of other effective area-based conservation measures, or the OECMs. But as state actors begin to incorporate coral restoration into their national conservation policies, it isn't clear whether states will actively support locally led interventions or whether coral restoration itself will then become top-down and then fall into the traps of fortress models of conservation. So to conclude, I do think the post-wild is a useful concept for rethinking relations with the non-human and in terms of how and why conservation is practiced, but it should only be used, as I said, as a secondary and complementary strategy that is combined with mitigating the root causes of environmental change. And whilst there are significant potential pitfalls, including those associated with fortress models of conservation and as well as those relating specifically to restoration, We do have evidence of empirical examples, particularly of coral restoration, that highlight how interventions that are led by Indigenous peoples and local communities and centre on local values, knowledges and goals, and utilise locally appropriate governance frameworks can produce multiple types of transformations in conservation policy and practice. But for restoration in the post-wild more broadly to be transformative, they do need to be tied to human rights and justice-based approaches to conservation. So I think I'll leave that there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that excellent talk, Josh. And again, love the sort of common themes between yours and Rosaleen's talk so far, highlighting the absolute importance of local involvement in conservation efforts. I mean, you know, without that, and we've had evidence, especially in recent weeks, that without that, we can't really have anything close to success with these ventures. So. Excellent. So our final speaker, last but not least, I'm very pleased to introduce Scott Leatham from the University of Edinburgh. Scott will be presenting a paper entitled Ecological Civilization, COP Themes and China's Global Environmental Governance, One Discourse or Many. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks very much, Heather. Thank you as well to the organisers and panelists. It's been a really interesting discussion so far. So I'm just going to try sharing my screen, and hopefully that will run nice and smoothly. I think that's potentially worked. Okay, so actually I'm now struggling. There it is. So hopefully everyone can see the screen, the presentation okay. So yeah, my name's Scott. I work at University of Edinburgh and the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, which is a sort of alternative higher education establishment. So what I'd like to talk about here, as the title's changed a wee bit since I originally proposed this, in order to fit with the broader theme, I revisit some of my PhD work, which was kind of finished about this time last year, but built on field work in China and in some of the international spaces that China was occupying at the time, including COP23, some interviews and so on from there. So what I build on is primarily a discourse analysis with subsequent interviews in and around China, based on this idea of ecological civilization. Reason for choosing this and the reason for kind of revisiting some of this work from a wee bit earlier is because, of course, it is a theme of, or is the theme of COP15 in the CPD. That was announced in 2019, obviously with the intention of that going ahead in 2020, and of course that was delayed to 2021. Nevertheless, it's still there in the theme. It's interesting to note, however, that ecological civilization as a phrase doesn't always appear, and it doesn't appear as often as the phrase living in harmony with nature, which has quite a long genesis in certainly Chinese discourse, but others as well. Nevertheless, the overall theme was announced by China in 2019, and some of the process of how China reached this quite wide-ranging and quite all-encompassing framework is, to me, very interesting. So, China recently put out the host official website for the conference, and of course, ecological civilization is quite front and center in describing that. So, the first thing I wanted to look at is to consider whether or not we can think of this as a kind of transformational framework. Does it really allow the discursive resources to think of this as, or to invest this with transformative, with radical potentials? So to be clear, I'm coming at this from the point of view of a political ecologist. And and particularly of a discourse analyst as well. And so I'm interested in how these discourses operate and bring subjects into being, and quite importantly, how they exclude alternative ways of knowing, and how they foreclose radical and transformative potentialities. So relatively early on, it's been outlined by quite a few people in sort of 2010, 2011, 2012 about the potential for China to have a different kind of role in environmental governance, and specifically in regards to taking leadership from, in a post-Copenhagen world where EU leadership wasn't terribly effective, US leadership wasn't terribly effective. Fast forward obviously to the Trump years, and that leadership question again is in obviously serious concern at this point. So some are putting forward this idea of ecological civilization as actually seriously transformative, as representing the potential to undermine and challenge directly the capitalist logics that for them were ultimately responsible for ecological and climatic crises. And certainly as a political ecologist, that's where I'm locating the kind of the ultimate problem, as well as, of course, the more proximate and immediate impacts. Ultimately, this is a problem of capital accumulation and inequality and unjust distributions of power and access to justice and so on and so forth. So these early articulations, these early arguments, some of them are putting forward these quite radical claims that actually ecological civilization can present this challenge. Of course, it's important to point out that they were also putting this in the context of, well, China's socialism of Chinese characteristics, Xi Jinping thought, and so on, haven't exactly been terribly radical, and have increasingly leaned towards more neoliberal policymaking, both in a kind of de facto domestic context, but also in international spaces. So this isn't to say that it's a wholesale kind of signing up to the idea that ecological civilization is inherently radical, but it is to say that there was that argument at the house, there was potential there. So I want to investigate what that actually meant, what kinds of metaphors were being put forward to articulate this challenge, what kinds of subjectivities did folk have to engage with, what kind of discursive resources do they have to engage with that might actually be undermining this, broadly speaking, neoliberal sustainability agenda, whether that's in terms of human nature dichotomies, whether it's in terms of the foreclosure of pluriversal knowledge systems or indigenous knowledges, or whatever it is. So, beginning with that idea that actually that this could be quite a fundamental challenge, the CETA announces a theme of COP15 was quite an interesting step, and it did make me revisit a lot of the work that I was doing at the time, because that announcement came as I was kind of in the middle of all of this. And so the question that I was pursuing quite quickly became, how can we answer this question of, is it transformative, or can it be transformative? Or is it simply reproducing neoliberal structures? And the answer that I came to is really it's both, because what we see is quite different articulations in a domestic context compared to an international context. So going back to 2006, I'm going to have to get some of these quotes because they're not actually necessarily in order. I realized after I started. Going back to 2006, which I've now, excuse me, just a second. Sorry, this is why you don't write a presentation the night before. Well, not to write. Back to 2006, the vice president of one of the environmental government agencies in China outlined in what was called an expert article on stop sharing actually because it's become distracting. An expert article on ecological civilization, and what they put forward was this idea that actually we need to challenge the capitalist logics, and it was a direct attack on neoliberal sustainable development. Back in 2006, often ecological civilization within China is dated back to 2007, which I'm not alluding as some kind of conspiracy theory that conveniently misses out this expert opinion piece. from a state actor that outlines actually quite a direct attack on Western capitalist logics in regards to sustainability. But it's interesting that this is largely left out of that kind of official canon, if you like, that fills out this phrase of ecological civilization. Because it's there that we see the first deployment of terms like living in harmony with nature as part of building and constructing an ecological civilization. And it's that phrasing of living in harmony with nature that is promoted as this kind of fundamental reworking of the human nature dichotomy. But what we actually see is beyond the kind of the more domestic articulations of ecological civilization, wherein China orchestrates itself in several ways. One is to reinforce the legitimacy of the party, the legitimacy of state-based actions in response to sustainability. In addition to showing how it's going to be improving the livelihood in terms of well-being, in terms of the ability for increased consumerism at the same time as material and energy inputs will be decreased. So it's already constructing these very difficult contradictions within that kind of internal discourse logic, whereby it's going to both improve material well-being and reduce how much material is going to be flowing through the economy. It's important to note that a lot of the gains made in China domestically have often been pushed by things like domestic oversupply of photovoltaic cells and the need to find a market for these in terms of solar power and so on. So there's a lot of internal push factors here as well that are contributing to the green agenda. So that's kind of the domestic articulation. It's very much, it's showing China as able to reconstruct no less than civilization in this image of what Xi Jinping outlines as having green mountains and gold mountains in this really interesting sort of rhetorical flourish, whereby we are encouraged to see nature as the route to expanding economic prosperity. However, when we shift to international spaces, this articulation actually changes quite considerably, and it becomes not so much about challenging sustainable development in the kind of neoliberal sense, but actually reinforcing it, showing how it's compatible with it. Quite early on in my work, I came across an example where the Chinese version of a document was quite different to the English translation. So in the Chinese version, the phrase ecological civilization was clear there. We are going to construct a Chinese ecological civilization. In the English version, however, that was changed to ecological progress. This also was repeated in 2019, even though it was by that point announced as the theme for the COP15. In the second Paris Peace Conference, we had that phrase appear again, ecological civilization, in the official Chinese version. But in the English version that you find on Anglophone embassies, New Zealand, UK, Australia, etc., that phrasing was replaced again with ecological progress. But so was the tense. So instead of it being the future tense, we will construct an ecological civilization, it was changed to we are working towards ecological progress. Now, this is obviously quite a small thing, and invariably with kind of working across languages, there will be spaces where there'll be times when obviously translations don't quite match up, or different translators have done things differently. That's to be expected. But when you see a kind of multiple times where the international expression for a flagship policy is actually translated differently, that's something else, I think. Haydn et al. In 2017, I think it was, argued in the first case that this might be a case of making a domestic agenda more palatable in an international space. That was when there was only one example that folk could actually find. That is a couple of examples. I think that's worth revisiting. You know, it was there an attempt to kind of make this more palatable in order to make it more of a legitimate feature of international governance, which was obviously neoliberal. So, fast forward into COP15 and what we can actually expect in terms of how it's being received as an agenda. it's not inherent to simply coining these terms of living in harmony with nature or ecological civilization that we can expect a more transformational approach, or certainly not a radical approach, because it's going to depend on how these terms are actually invested with meaning in terms of the practices that they actually signify. And what we're seeing, I would argue, is the coining of these terms, the appropriation almost of these terms, in order to actually codify business as usual. So instead of human nature relations, we still have that being reduced to a consumer-consumed relationship. Even though domestic articulations actually arguably allow for that more kind of pluriversal potential there in how we conceive of ourselves as part of nature. In the international articulations, those kinds of meanings are absent. Instead, they're replaced with ways that nature will be useful to humanity, and of course, encompassing the language of ecosystem services, natural capital, and other forms of valuing nature in terms of its service to humans. So I'm actually not quite sure how much time I've taken up, but I expect it might be useful to end there. I do go into a lot more detail in the paper if we want to follow up with obviously the data that informs these analyses. So I'll simply conclude by saying that this adoption of living in harmony with nature, aside from its potential genesis in arguably still very problematic discourses in China, we are not going to reach there's not going to be an inherent or automatic rejection of the nature-human dichotomy or the capitalist logics that have reinforced it and benefited from it, simply because we're talking about it a little bit differently. Because what we're seeing increasingly is that terminology being used to aestheticize that process and render it more legitimate on the idea that it might help encompass different knowledge systems. What I fundamentally argue is that we are still at significant risk of this kind of epistemic violence that was outlined earlier as well in one of the presentations really well, I thought. This kind of epistemic erosion, this epistemic violence, whereby knowing nature needs an ever-increasing human agency over nature in order to account for it, in order to parcel it up and package it into bits and pieces that can be bought and sold and traded and offset and so on. So that is to say, to end on a somewhat negative note, that this idea of living in harmony with nature as the theme of COP15 needs to be a demand that we make of COP15. And by that, I mean it needs to have sight of the key environmental justice principles and not simply be a term by which we reproduce neoliberal sustainable agendas. So thank you very much. I'll end there.
Thank you so much for that, Scott, and really nice to end on sort of a regional or a national focus and to sort of put some of these debates and issues into the spotlight.